What's up, everybody? It's John here with, let's see, Xintimaci? 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 You know, I just started the channel and I was kind of having to work with the title in between something like wanting to talk about the idea of just like what the X means, and there's also other like film reasons that I want to talk about and other cultural reasons when I talk about it, so I kind of wanted to put the X at the front. But to be honest, I don't really have a clear sense of like how it's supposed to sound, and I kind of think one of the reasons why I like the title is because I don't know exactly how it sounds, and it kind of suits my sense of confusion about all of the stuff that I'm working through here culturally, and also like as I'm working on this big dissertation that I'm writing. So anyway, that's just another like semi-dissertation about how I don't even know what I'm talking about when I actually like come up with the title for this channel, or the name for this channel. But anyway, we're gonna still keep it what it is because that's what it already is. And even though I don't know how to pronounce it, and even though I'm probably going to say it in some weird way every single time I do a video here, I'm gonna keep it because I like it. I like the letter X, I like what it represents culturally, I like what it represents in terms of the unknown, and I like it as a way to explore intimacy in cinema and in culture in general here inside the United States, which is what most of this is going to be focused on, at least in these early stages. The way that I'm looking at intimacy is kind of like it's going against the grain somewhat of how we've looked at it, I feel, for a long time inside this country, and the way that the United States tends to kind of prioritize its view of intimacy, which is as it is focusing on the proximal, getting closer and closer and closer to whatever the desired object is. That's not really how intimacy is maintained, and it's definitely not even how it's generated. It may feel that way, that we're constantly trying to get closer to the other, and I believe that is part of intimacy, is getting closer, becoming more and more familiar, sharing more and more of our private lives. And those are the kinds of intimacy that I would call close intimacies, or proximal intimacies, where they thrive in that sense of closeness. The argument I'm going to be making, though, is that we also have what I would refer to as distant intimacies. Those things that we are maybe desirous of, but we are not yet what we would call like close to them. They're still unfamiliar to us. They still probably invoke some kind of fear of the unknown inside of us, and that puts us kind of at odds with our desire to be a part of those things, or to be included in those things, to be a part of those intimate relationships. And so we have this distance intimacy, but we also have this proximal intimacy, right? And what I'm arguing is that the experience of intimacy, the way that it's generated and the way that it's actually sustained long term, doesn't come from either one of these, but from the friction, the tension that we experience when the two are actually combined. When we have our sense of what we might say like our proximal intimacy, the one that we're really familiar with, the one that makes us feel secure and stable all the time, my best friend, my partner, my spouse, my parents, my this or that. Of course, these relationships could be totally messed up and not make us feel like our best self at all times, but these are the ones we're more familiar with, so they give us a more sense of stability. But what about those ones that are kind of like outside of those relationships, or challenge the forms of those relationships, or even make us see those relationships in ways that they could be renewed or taken in a different direction that could be really, really generative, but at the same time could make us feel very, very nervous, like we're going to jeopardize the relationship, right? We're going to mess it up in some way. I think like an example of this might be the concept of friends with benefits, right? Which we're always told is just a terrible idea. And the main reason why is because the benefits of sexual contact are actually going to ruin the friendship that's already there. Now, I don't really know if there's any statistics on this. I think it's just kind of a general rule to follow. Let's say don't do that, but it's also a general rule that everyone seems to kind of like appreciate not following, at least from time to time, in terms of how, you know, like they feel about their friendship, but also how they feel about their sexual desire towards people that they are close with, how they renegotiate or want to renegotiate those intimacies. The desire to be more sexual, you might say, right? Or to be sexual at all with a platonic friend is kind of taking the intimacy that's already familiar and then challenging it with that distant intimacy that might still be desired, right? At the same time, a married couple who is unfortunately reached the end of their marriage, or they've kind of fallen out of love, they have that very, very, very strong, or I should say established, probably more than strong, very established sense of intimacy, right? But it's breaking down, it's falling apart. And so now their intimacy has to move into this new state of the divorce process, the way that their life, which was very present tense with each other, is now going to be transferred or shifted into more of like a past tense, a memory of the relationship. And now that's how we actually practice our intimacy, more through the memory. And then of course, even the present tense one with the former spouse now has to take on a new relationship. Is it hateful and bitter? Is it somehow move back to the platonic? Like we had platonic and then friends with benefits, and then maybe got married, and then we moved back from it. So what is this spectrum of intimacy that we move across that involves both the very, very proximal, close sense that makes us feel stable, and the very, very distant sense that may make us feel like the ground underneath us is getting quite tremulous, right? And we don't quite know where we stand, and what can result from those feelings, from those renegotiations of intimacy. That's what I'm arguing, or at least trying to figure out how to argue, is how it functions inside our lives, especially here in the United States. And it's an argument that, I'll be honest, it begins with a feeling. It's just more of what I feel. But it's something that I believe that from that affect, there is an actual truth that with proper study, research, and just rigorous attention to the project at hand, I believe I can uncover, or at least come up with something fruitful, or at the very least just have a really good time talking about movies and culture and all sorts of cool shit that, I think is cool, and I hope you think is cool as well. But why X? Well, the reason why X is because, to me, it suits this idea in a model form of what I'm trying to say about intimacy, right? Intimacy, I said, is this kind of simultaneous tension and friction of the proximal, the closeness that we feel very, very comfortable with, and also the distant intimacy that pulls away, that makes us kind of feel like we are on more unstable ground, right? And those two things driving together. Well, the X, that actual mark, it has that kind of implicit in its gestural posture, right? Especially if we think of the X as like a crossroads, a crossroads that represents like where I've been coming from and where am I going forward, right? It's that liminal space. It's that where are you going, where have you been? Shout out Joyce Carol Oates. Anyway, it's this idea of, talk about that story, right? Joyce Carol Oates, like that is one messed up view of how to negotiate intimacy.
I know, my Connie. I've been watching you.
Anyway, I'm getting way off track here. Let's get back to the actual topic of this, which is going to be about the idea of the X. The X is like an intersection or a crossroads. It's driving towards, but also pulling away simultaneously. The same lines that come towards the intersection are the same ones, the same vectors that eventually push away or pull away from it. And so you're kind of always within that tension, if we think about it metaphorically, right, of the intersection coming together, and it creates its intimacy by being both at the same time, a pulling away and a coming closer. And so also that can invite different ways of looking at intimacy from an intersectional lens. Not necessarily saying that, you have to apply everything that you might get from Kimberly Crenshaw's essays, but a way to kind of expand on some of the cultural work that's been done with the brilliant work that Crenshaw did in terms of anti-discrimination law. We'll bring in some of that as well as we go forward with some of these videos. Anyway, so going back to the idea of looking at the X as a kind of place of if you will, like two, what Sarah Ahmed might call phenomenological lines, right? The lines that lead us through space, but not just through physical space, also through cultural space, right? And also through the intimate space of relations that we have with our fellow human beings and pets and objects and selves. The other thing is that the X kind of has this cultural meaning for us that I think lends to this idea of being both specific and the idea of being like familiar, like this is the thing I know very, very well, it's very specific to me, and then also being general. So again, we see this push and pull, this kind of like liminal there but not there with intimacy as expressed to the idea of the X, right? And I know this is weird because I was just talking about getting divorced. I really do, I mean the X here, I don't exactly mean like your ex, but if that fun little thing sneaks in there as well, all right, you can think about the X as your X as well. But the X in terms of like how it was used to be a marking for somebody in terms of like making your X, right? Here I show that I am a specific person who witnessed something or signed something on a specific date, but I don't have a full name, a full identity, so my X marks the spot, right? X marks my gender. X in the sense of I don't fall into either of the binarized, or even if it's not a binary, maybe there's like 15 choices, but I don't fall into any of those categories. So there's this kind of like resistance to categorization that the X implies while still specifying the actual subject that it's referring to, right? It's almost like a general reference towards a specific. And that contrast, I think, helps with this idea of intimacy that the X provides. The other, I think, kind of like saying that's very familiar with the idea of the X is X marks the spot, right? So once again, we have this very, very specific location, but it's generally something's hidden there, right? There's some kind of idea or treasure or who knows what it is, and I need to land upon that. I need to discover that. I need to dig it up. So it's made, at least like on a map, right, to not look very, very specific. This isn't something that I'm going to clearly have marked, but the X itself gives that inside knowledge, that inside familiarity, right? So even on the idea of like cartography or of a map leading to a certain place, the X marks the spot concept, if we think of it in terms of how I'm talking about intimacy, the X marks the spot as both specific, but in a kind of like hidden or general sense because it isn't a specific word. It isn't a specific place or location. Just like when someone like makes their X, it's not a specific name. Just like being gender X isn't a specific gender, but that doesn't take away from the subjectivity of the individual who's inhabiting that name, inhabiting that non-gender, or that gender fluidity, or just basically inhabiting that space where they're now going to start digging to find some kind of treasure. It's the idea that the importance of the intimacy, the generative side of it, the sustaining of the intimacy comes from that intersection of both vagueness and specificity, of both closeness and distance.